We're now going to tell a story about a success, a wild societal success. I should actually say societies plural, because my guest is Nick Cowen, who's a criminologist at the University of Lincoln, that's in the UK. He also teaches and has an affiliation with NYU. And what he's writing about is something that maybe we take for granted as having been solved, but shouldn't. If we look at the recent history, it's drunk driving. And from our success as societies on drunk driving, he extrapolates a few other areas that we may yet achieve some success. Nick, welcome to The Gist.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you begin by talking about your grandfather, who was a doctor who, like almost all of his generation, would drive drunk from time to time. Now, I know enough from having read your work, just this piece, that you put this in there perhaps not only for narrative reasons, but to establish things like norms, to connect with the reader, to explain that you are not a cold-hearted, carceral fellow, but someone who has a lot of sympathy for everyone involved in this story, right? There was strategy involved.
Oh, yeah. Well, I must say, actually, this article began with the puzzle. It was after having some conversations with the editors at Works in Progress magazine, where the article appeared, and they have an interest in crime reduction because they think that crime is a big barrier to establishing kind of livable cities. So it's a big issue that they're facing because they're often supportive of housing reform, basically allowing more people to move into cities. And they notice that when this comes up in debates, people are very concerned about crime, and they're right to be concerned. And so they were kind of looking, well, how do you tackle crime? What do we really know about how to prevent crime, not just to detect it and punish it after it's happened? And I was kind of like looking around, thinking, well, how can we figure that out? And then I realized, well, there's something really strange going on that we haven't really talked about enough. And that's that some crimes can be committed by almost anyone. I mean, in inverted commas, in the sense that, all kinds of human behavior exists along a continuum. But I was kind of thinking that everyone or nearly everyone commits some sort of crime over the course of their lives. So there's some ordinary crimes out there. And then I realized drink driving and occasionally killing people through drink driving is something which can be committed or has been committed in the past by a very wide variety of people, including people who would basically consider themselves and be widely considered upstanding members of a community. Like my grandfather, who served the UK military, at the end of World War II as an army medic, and then went into general practice and was basically a pillar of his local community.
Saved many lives while endangering others, potentially.
Exactly. So there seemed to be a bit of a tension there. And it occurred to me that he would be quite concerned about harming someone in most contexts. But because a lot of his colleagues and peers would make the same risk analysis and would imagine that, well, maybe statistically they can beat the statistics. Like they are a particularly good driver, including when they've had maybe one or two too many, and so they are exempt from that, from that particular crime. They don't become a criminal just because they break the law in that way. And while there's still an element of that in societies today, I was looking at the statistics in New York City, and actually there's been a little bit of a spike in drink driving and drink driving related accidents in the last couple of years. It's much
Although
less.
I do have to tell you, this year we're on pace to set a record for fewest vehicular homicides since almost ever. Isn't that amazing?
That's fantastic. And the thing about criminology is I've noticed that, including in academia, but also in the media, we tend to focus on the bad stories. Mm-hmm. And the advantage of Works in Progress, I mean, its theme is like, how did we end up where we are now? And can we appreciate the situation that we've ended up in, like the levels of civilization where we have achieved it? And can we explain how we got there? And then I realized, well, this is a little bit of a puzzle. We have to explain how drink driving driving norms change so dramatically over the course of a relatively short time span. In the time span of norms, like a blink of an eye, 30 years is sort of where what I was kind of looking at, where the kind of big change happened from 1980 to 2010, and that's a puzzle that kind of needs to be explained, and that means that we can think about how some other types of crime might be tackled using a similar strategy.
Right. So norms is the answer, the usual answer for how Mothers Against Drunk Driving and those organizations gained societal purchase, were listened to, and were followed to the point where children, even for me, I'm a little bit older than I ever remembered drunk driving being anything other than anathemized. Mm-hmm. But it was the case, and you don't have to go back to your grandfather's day. For many, many years, just the idea of a designated driver was a phrase that did not exist. So there was a successful defining of a norm, propagating of a norm, reinforcing of a norm, and it worked. Drunk driving became a thing that good, reasonable people who cared about each other just wouldn't do. You'd be ashamed to do it. Now, you bring in some other theories and also some great old papers from 1985 that I was reading through about one researcher said, it doesn't look like there's really anything we could do about drunk driving, so let's just essentially make the cars safer, which actually did happen and it worked. But you also bring in some examples of deterrence theory, because it was thought that you can't just deter, punish people out of drunk driving. You have to also, or maybe only, enforce the norm. But tell me how deterrence interacts with drunk driving to create a virtuous cycle.
So basically, deterrence is this idea that you can change the cost-benefit analysis that people might be undertaking when considering whether to commit crime, or maybe not considering but tempted to commit a crime in the moment, or maybe when they're planning their evening, like what their transport plan might look like. And basically, the theory is that people are going to take into account the likelihood of being caught, the severity of the punishment if they are caught, and harder to measure, the speed at which they might be apprehended in the event that they're caught. When we look at some crime types, in other work I've looked at theft, it looks like the speed at which you're apprehended is particularly important for certain types of crime. But the theory is that we're kind of rational at the margin. We're not perfectly rational actors, but we're rational enough that if we can perceive the chance of there being a sanction, we might be tempted to do something else, or to refrain from committing an offence altogether, to find some alternative to drink driving in this case. Now, when you kind of look at it like in aggregate, and you kind of look at individual criminal justice interventions, it doesn't appear to do all that much. Like, it's just like a few percentages here and there. I dug into the literature, and I found that I thought that the best chance of making an impact is to kind of engage in prevention rather than waiting for someone to actually kill someone on the road. And the invention and the widespread use of the breathalyzer, this is something that was particularly well done in the UK, done to a certain extent in some US states, and so you can see a reduction, but maybe not quite as systematic reduction for various reasons. And the advantage of the breathalyzer, if you're kind of going out, you're testing people either randomly or testing people who appear to be, driving not as well as they should be driving, is that you have this opportunity to catch people before they've actually committed a more severe offence. If they haven't harmed someone, they've merely risked harm someone, then you've actually got a much wider range of sanctions that you can apply. So people aren't going to be too bothered if initially it's a kind of a hefty fine or a short driving ban if you haven't actually killed someone. And that means you can actually hand out a lot more sanctions, and they don't have to be particularly severe at that level. There's some good literature that suggests that at the margin that makes an important difference. So people who were caught out and were later tested again, randomly or administratively, were less likely to be caught inebriated subsequently. And those who were caught like substantially over the limit, just over substantially over the limit, and then sanctioned actually quite hard, they were substantially less likely again to be caught over the limit subsequently. So in other words, their reoffending rate went down. Now, this on its own doesn't make an enormous difference because it's just micro interactions. It's just people being pulled over by police. Perhaps the fact that police are pulling people over and people can see that even if they're not being pulled over has a bit of a deterrent effect as well. But mostly this is just like micro interactions that are making small changes to individual drivers. But on my account, if you combine this with a kind of, with widespread communication, so public communication saying, police are out there doing this, and moreover, the community approves of the police doing this. They approve of pulling people over, checking and making sure that they're driving safely. Then that kind of sends a message which eventually produces a tipping point, such that people realize that in this community, it's not just wrong and harmful; it's actually abnormal. It's deviant. And people actually worry a lot more about whether their behavior is common rather than whether it's moral. People are worried about whether something's moral, but they're very worried about whether something would look weird to other people.
Well, it is called a norm, which is normal. And that you have a good study in there about how the state of Montana was trifurcated. And they did a very clever study that just essentially convinced people, 4 out of 5 people don't drink and drive. And then when they did follow-up surveys about people who were maybe considering it, young kids, they would say, no, I wouldn't drink and drive when they were treated to the study that showed just how abnormal it was.
Yeah.
But I also want to emphasize that even though we thought that deterrence wasn't really applicable that much in drunk driving, and for many years it wasn't, deterrence plus the notion that this is abnormal, if you do deter the action, it does make it more and more abnormal. So if you arrest or disincentivize drunk driving, it actually becomes true that it's literally less common and less normal, thus reinforcing the message. But I wonder, when you are talking about, since you're getting to the overall point of what can be done with other kinds of crime, is drunk driving different from most other kinds of property crime and violent crime in that you don't get anything after you drunk drive like one would with a burglary, and you don't exact revenge upon anyone. In fact, when you're drunk driving, you're essentially hoping that you get away with something so that there's no effect of you ever having drunk driven, and you can't even look back and say, look what I got from that. Maybe a trip from the pub that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So is there a complication to drunk driving as a particular type of crime and applying that to, say, burglary or violence?
I think burglary and violence are certainly different, but actually, if you look at property crime, once again, these things exist along a continuum. So having dobbed my own grandfather in around his thing, I thought I shouldn't do anyone else apart from myself. So I acknowledged that when I was a bit younger, and perhaps before Spotify and Netflix kind of took over the space, I used to download a lot of copyrighted material, and I would justify it to myself as like I'm kind of like some kind of pirate libertarian, which people of a certain age and a certain mentality might do, and go like, copyright is theft anyway. But of course, really, I did it because it was convenient, and I was very confident that I would not be caught and punished. And It was very common in my peer group to do that. So that's like one example. But even if we look at physical property, an enormous number of people will steal just a little bit at self-checkout counters at supermarkets or grocery stores. So there's been some studies on that. I think about a fifth of self-checkout users do that, and not just people who are doing it, systematically, or kind of, or in a desperate situation either. You'll get people who are perfectly high income, or they don't have to do it, but they kind of think, ooh, those Brazil nuts, they're looking pretty expensive right now. But what if I just scanned it and like inputted it as if it was like another packet of peanuts? Quite a big difference, like several dollars difference in your in your money. And you know what? If I'm caught, I can always say, oh, it was a mistake, or the machine did it, that kind of thing. There's always plausible deniability, and that's common. It's also theft. It's a small amount of theft, but it adds up. In the world of logistics, they call that shrinkage as a kind of a nice way of putting it. But it's like it's going on. It's going on constantly, and it's done because people, they might justify it, sort of members of the public who don't ordinarily engage in crime. They might justify it because it's like they're stealing from a corporation. They're not necessarily thinking through all the dynamics of what it means if you're stealing from your local shop and what that means in terms of additional costs and additional security that eventually has to come on down the line, and whether a shop can operate at all.
I do it as a blow for labor, because if we could show that the shrinkage of the self-scan checkout overwhelms the cost of actually paying a human being, maybe they'll hire back the human being.
Fantastic.
So, I don't support so many organizing efforts, but damn it, if I could make my voice heard through macadamia nuts, I will. By the way, the other thing that's interesting about the Napster example, if that's what you were doing, you're pilfering through, and the self-scan checkout example, is that it's also true that if it's more convenient to steal than to just pay the price, people will steal. That
Absolutely.
is true of both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's at the margin where these things happen. But I would say that it means that fundamentally we can probably change an awful lot of crimes and prevent an awful lot of crimes by thinking about social norms, because very few people, even people who commit quite a lot of crimes, are entirely immune to social norms. There's a handful, so we would call them psychopaths, and we find them at all levels of society, including running big businesses and engaging in large scale fraud and that kind of thing. There's even a few in academia that if you kind of look and they even occasionally get discovered. But do
you think that's where the non-conditional offenders, and what's the word for that, by the way?
Non-conditional offenders, or potentially usual suspects, as I might say. So people, the ones who aren't too effective, so the ones who get caught frequently, they become well known to police. And so police tend to get a picture of the typical criminal as someone who is very immune to social norms, someone who really is like built very differently from others. And it's true, there's a handful of people like that. But I think that the way that police are investigating crimes after the fact, that means that they encounter those sort of people a lot more, and we perhaps underestimate the conditional offender. So people who are in a community where they're aware that there's quite a lot of crime going on, and perhaps they're more likely to be victims themselves. If people are growing up in a kind of high crime community and they're more likely to, say, get roughed up by the local gang or intimidated, they might in turn think, well, society isn't really looking after me. Therefore, I can, at some margin, steal a few things as well. Maybe I need to get tough. Maybe I need to be willing to use violence to achieve my ends as well. So there can be a very unfortunate kind of vicious cycle that you can get into, where you end up with concentrated levels of crime in certain areas. And that means that, people who are habitually victimized also feel that they're not part of the social contract, and therefore they may commit offenses as well.
Yeah. So to define terms, you're right. We can call people who may or may not commit crimes based on the degree of moral costs conditional offenders. Where crime is low, they will sense that offending is wrong, and most crimes will be committed by hard cases who are resistant to social considerations. And then you later go on and contrast them to persistent offenders, in that they commit offenses with some frequency despite well-established norms. And your point is, just like with drunk driving and other things that seem more governed by, or scanning out items at the drugstore, at the pharmacy, that it may seem like there are certain types of crimes that would fall into that norm theory, but you're saying all types of crime, more or less, fit into the idea of that there are so many conditional offenders out there. And if we can create the norm, including the all but guarantee of enforcement and the societal norm against this offending, we can do a lot to alleviate all sorts of crime, including homicide.
That's right. That's right. So this is like looking at over, a broader sweep, about 500 years, the development of the modern state and, modern legal and criminal justice systems. But basically, if you go back a few hundred years, you'll find that homicide is a lot more common, including at every level in society. In fact, according to some studies, it was somewhat more likely to happen among aristocratic elites. They were more violent than, say, the middle classes and the working classes of their day, because they had an honor culture. So that they felt that if they were offended or their family was offended in some way, they might need to defend their honor, and they would do it through violence, sometimes chaotic violence, and then over time some norms evolved so that you would challenge someone to a duel instead, and that meant that at least rather than it being like families on families, it would be like two individuals kind of settling matters. And of course, in the early United States history, that's still something that happens, among senators and presidential candidates and that kind of thing. So elites used to be a lot more violent. But over time, we've managed to change that norm so that, kind of engaging in that kind of violence to kind of defend your honor is kind of, it's not just considered wrong, it's also considered, once again, very abnormal. It'd be like, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you using that to kind of settle your disputes? It's just, it's just you're not just a bad person, you're just kind of a crazy person. If in most social milieus, if you wish to settle, most forms of disputes with violence, and so that implies that within us, within all of us, there's probably a reasonable capacity for violence, because in our kind of natural history, violence would often be on the table, and as we can see, norms can change very quickly. If we look around the world, suddenly violence can become normal again. But it means that crimes from very minor, or shall we say non-malicious crimes. Drink driving is not a malicious crime in the sense that you're intending to cause someone harm. But from that crime all the way up to ones where I'm going to kill someone because that's going to solve a problem for me. All of those things are within our potentiality. It's always within our possibility. And the fact that we've managed to get homicide to historically such an amazing low is impressive, and it shows quite how strong sanctions backed by the dissemination of civilized social norms can be.
So I want to go back. You said the non-conditional offender, we call those people psychopaths, and that's definitely a category. But doesn't that call into question the entire logic of root cause theory? That the root cause theory is people will never people resort to crime because they don't have opportunities otherwise, or they might resort to violence because that is the best way to garner resources. And if times weren't so tough, they wouldn't have to. But you're saying that that's not a good description of why perpetual offenders are still committing crimes?
What I say is it doesn't explain the very substantial reduction in crime over the last 500 years.
Right. Or even 20 years, because it's not like, some of the root causes probably have been alleviated since 1300. But if you look at the huge drop in crime since 2014, I don't know there's been a huge
No, there hasn't been.
Yeah, the same people saying root cause theory aren't saying, although we've been doing great since 2014.
Well, I mean, it also depends which root cause theories you're looking at. There's a controversial theory, and I think more controversial as it's turned out to be hard to replicate in a few ideas, that lead in the bloodstream. Usually the people get when they're growing up. So when before we had unleaded petrol, and when we had kind of lead paint everywhere and in the pipes, in the water pipes, that kind of thing, that is associated with higher propensity to aggression. So you might think of that as a root cause. It's still got like a biological mechanism, so it's not quite what many people talking about the root cause would say.
But they usually mean socioeconomics.
But I mean, but of course, that maps onto socioeconomic. You'd be more exposed to lead. Like bad old cars and bad old water. I think if you're in a poor
when leaded gasoline was everywhere in the world before it was banned in the 1970s, everyone got a
everyone got a dose for sure.
You're right. Old peeling public housing is not distributed evenly. Sorry, go ahead.
But yes, absolutely. I mean, there will be root causes, but this idea that the immediate social environment and the norms that establish what is acceptable behavior, that doesn't seem like a standard root cause. It's something that you could, in a sense, change quite rapidly, or at least can change quite rapidly. We're still trying to figure out how to like use this technique in every case, but it does speak slightly against root causes. I mean, the other thing is that someone might not be born with a high propensity to aggression. There's some very good literature. This one a little less controversial than the lead hypothesis, that getting a really nasty knock on the head when you're young can lead to quite substantial personality changes and can make you a lot more aggressive in later life. So one other thing to look at is to see what sort of events, what sort of life events are people likely going through after they're born, and can we make sure that people are kind of kept safe so that they don't have like particularly traumatic especially sort of bodily traumatic events that affect their that affect their brain. So I wouldn't say that just because there's some people who as adults are extremely resistant to social norms, i.e. have got these psychopathic tendencies, didn't mean that they had to be that way. There's things that we can do to ensure that fewer people have that kind of have those kind of behavioral traits as adults.
So in the United States, 50% of murders occur in 2% of the counties. And then when you take it down to the zip code, the postal code level, 50%, within those counties, there was a Yale study that showed that 50% of shootings occur within 5% of census tracts or blocks. Are those places the epicenters of American violence, which is the most violent of all OECD countries? Is that most ripe for the norm-based change in behavior, or will those be the hardest to change in the same way that we convinced your grandfather or maybe the next generation that drunk driving was just not a thing that proper people did?
I think, that would be an area where those would be areas that would probably be most ripe, because basically it means that living in those areas, there are a lot of people with perfectly ordinary personality traits who are existing in a very violent community and thus are realize that it's an option, it's something that people do, and that they may have to do it. Because if other people are willing to use violence, then they may have to use violence as well. So, in other words, social norms would not work for the kind of like lone wolf kind of someone who's committing homicide in places where you wouldn't expect a homicide to take place. Yes. So these individuals, they are tough and they've been hardened by circumstances. They are not intrinsically interested in engaging in violence, but they are in a community. So one option is to try and help people to escape that kind of community. So you kind of like allow people to rebuild communities elsewhere. And yes, various interventions to try and reduce the use of violence there. I mean, there have been a lot of successes. There has been a drop in homicide rates. I think we're getting close, possibly in 2025. Let's keep everything. But it's just about possible that we might have the lowest homicide numbers in the US since records have began. Yes. At least serious FBI records.
But I do think 2014 was the low.
Yes, so we get back down. Yeah, we might be able to get back down there to 2014.
But the early 1960s were also pretty low, almost the same thing. That's amazing, yeah.
So we could get there, and I'm sure some of it is by making these communities better. I know that there have been some very interesting interventions. They're very hard to replicate, but when they work, they're fantastic. When you kind of get gang wars that are kind of like put together through truces, where you kind of like get sort of respectable people in the community who kind of say, look, I spent a lot of time in prison. It's not a good idea. You younger guys, you can get together and settle your differences without engaging in kind of in significant violence. And it's very hard to find people who have that kind of charisma and status within the community who are capable of saying, now's the time to have a truce. But the great thing about norms is if you can get it right just that 1 year, you have a much better chance of getting it right the next year, because it's got this kind of compounding element that like the fewer crimes happen in the previous year, the less likely you are to get like a repeat of a very bad year. Right.
That's what all the criminologists say. There's the vicious cycle of revenge taking, but then if you break it, there's the virtuous cycle of fewer revenges that have to be taken. I do wonder, though, in these communities that are generating half our murders, is what's breaking through. I understand all the violence interrupters and it's good messaging. Is what breaks through going to be the kind of messaging that affects a Montana teen? Or are you going to have to show, not just through messaging, but through fact, that this is not the best way to solve the problems? This is not the only way to solve the problems. The risk of getting caught, we talk about deterrence, and we talk about the closure rates for open cases for murders. So my question is, won't you have to really show substantively that more murder and more violence is an irrational act to take in a way you haven't been over the last couple of years?
Yeah, so the key difference, I don't think it's a fundamental difference about the people. It's a difference about the story. So the case in Montana, they had a really good story to tell. And the best thing about it is it was true. Mm-hmm. They were saying it's quite unlikely that your peers are going to drive drunk. They say that most people in your community are using designated drivers. And the great thing about that is that it caused people who weren't aware of it to update. And they went like, oh, is that the case? And they look around, they go like, oh yeah, that's not just advertising, it's actually true. I'm just being informed of what the norm is. And the great thing about it is if you do it correctly, it reinforces the norm. Whereas if you start telling people that violence doesn't solve problems, but you're in a community where violence is the only way to solve problems, then
or there's no other way to solve problem. Maybe you're right, but what do you got? Yeah, if you don't have a good answer to that.
So you need to kind of modulate the message for that. And this is like a big challenge. Of course, there's a big problem of police legitimacy in the United States. So when dealing with black and other ethnic minority communities, so this is like it's hard. You need to find like an institution that's capable of speaking with some sense of legitimacy in some of these communities. We do have an issue of not so much gun crime, which is present but rare in our major city in London, but we do have a major issue of knife crime among some urban ethnic communities. We have trialed stop and search techniques where there's where police will search people who they suspect are carrying knives. There's a degree of randomness and there's also a degree of targetedness. So they're sort of trying to find people who might be engaged in gang activity. When you look at the most recent results, that is associated with much, much lower homicide rates subsequently. So I think rather like the drink drive case, catching people holding a knife, carrying a knife, not necessarily intending to commit a homicide, but they just think, well, just in case. It's controversial within the community. So people think they don't like stop and search. They don't like the idea that police can come along and, maybe profile someone or, on whatever grounds. And they say, well, we're going to search you and we're going to arrest you if we find that you've got a knife. But the results we've got suggest that kind of works. And ultimately it's the people who would be tempted to carry a knife who are most likely to be the beneficiaries. Just like drunk drivers, the most likely person to die in a drunk driving accident is the person who's drunk driving. But there are obviously other people who can be victimized. If you carry a knife in London, you're much more likely to end up in a violent altercation, and you're much more likely to die. So the fact that you're not carrying a knife can help, especially if you're applying it to a community, which means you're more confident fewer people are carrying knives. And it's controversial. It needs to be presented in a kind of non-paternalist way. It needs to be very carefully messaged, and also it means that you perhaps shouldn't be going for the very harsh sanctions. In other words, we often talk about mandatory minimum sentences for people who are, say, caught carrying a gun in the US or a knife in the UK. In my case, for my argument, I'm saying actually it would be better to catch more people, process them, give them a fine, or give them some kind of community disposal, give them some kind of kind of training on some sort of way of helping them, but just importantly, catch them and disarm them rather than put them in prison for a long period of time. If we're catching more people and punishing them less severely, that's more likely to be effective at changing a norm that is kind of very sticky in a particular community.
Has Britain been able to do it without credible charges of racial profiling and abuse during the search process?
No, that's a problem. Yeah. So, and that's why at various points,
one of the reasons it's a problem,
back.
Sorry to interrupt. One of the reasons it's a problem is that racial profiling is not just due to cruelty. It's more likely that these communities will have knife crime and people who are carrying knives as self-defense.
Yes, yeah, that is the difficulty. So we've got an intervention that, according to our best evidence, reduces crime and reduces the chances of the people who are being profiled ultimately becoming victims themselves, and yet in the moment, in the micro interaction, people take great offense and they feel really harmed by the fact that they've been searched. And of course, it doesn't help that there is police abuse. So, people fear, being taken off the street by police officers, disappearing into a police station, and, horrible things have happened. So, police might use that ability to take people away to commit violence themselves at various points. Now, in the UK, that's a rarity. It does happen, and any single case, of course, absolutely shreds police legitimacy, but it is a rarity, and so this is a difficult case where we can save lives, but at the same time, the people in the moment are going to feel like it's a massive imposition and in some cases an attack on their community.
How many have been carried out? We called it stop, question, and we called it stop and frisk, and then stop, question, and frisk. But how many in London? Is this only in London? Have they carried out?
It's something that's conducted throughout the United Kingdom, and because of the drug trade, it's something that is, even in my home city of Lincoln, it's something that the police will do because there's, there is some degree of knife crime and other types of violent crime that can take place, even in relatively rural areas. But yeah, when we're thinking about the sort of spike in homicide rates related to this, it is happening, a great deal in various parts of London. There have been tens of thousands of stopping and searches. So if you kind of look at, if you look at the article, it's of the same. It's of the same magnitude as breathalyzing as it was as done in the early 2000s. So
right.
It's that kind of it's quite an intense activity. You need to do a lot of stop and searches to save one homicide, yes. But we tend to think saving a life is worth a great deal, yes. Especially since it's not just saving that life. It's every life is important to save, but if you manage to get it down in this mechanical way by doing enough stop and searches, you make each murder less likely to happen, you make the murder rate lower and you make murder less common in that community, you kind of get that long-term, like, virtuous cycle. So you have to do a lot of stop and searches to do it, but if you do it, you can bring that murder rate down. So it's it's a tough thing, a tough thing to do. But I think it's something that's worth doing, and it's something that's worth communicating. That this is, in as best as way as possible, in order to make it feel legitimate across all communities.
This is also interesting to me because the lesson in America was that it worked, but there was such a huge backlash, not from just the community, but the courts, that it was greatly reduced as a program. But think of the numbers, and I want to put this forward for my listeners. We're talking about knife crimes in the UK, and it's a big problem. There's about 250 stabbing deaths a year in England and Wales. I know Scotland and Northern Ireland keep their own figures. 250, whereas there are almost, or in peak year, 20,000 homicides in the United States. Mm-hmm. The city of London has almost the same population as New York. And you just heard Nick saying that there were tens of thousands of stop and frisks. At the height of stop and frisk in New York, there were 700,000 almost.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's surprising to me. It just shows that the different cultures and the different places have different considerations. But it is one of those trade-offs where in the micro interactions, people feel greatly harmed, but it does lead to a reduction in the overall death rate. But the death rate is so much lower in the UK than it is the United States when you're comparing knives to guns. Throw it all in there, and you just got the hard choices that are representative of the criminologist and sociologist's lot in life, I guess.
Yes, that's absolutely.
Nick Cowen is a criminologist at the University of Lincoln, and for the Works in Progress magazine / website, he has written How the War on Drunk Driving Was Won. Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a wonderful conversation.